A perfect beginning, a slow unraveling. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the grand banquet hall, illuminating the polished floors and elegant table settings. It was a day that many had been eagerly anticipating. A day of celebration, a corporate event, and a family gathering all rolled into one. David, the CEO of one of the city's most prestigious firms, stood at the head of the room, greeting guests with the perfect combination of authority and charm. Beside him, his wife Sarah glided through the crowd with grace, her beauty and poise complementing his strong presence. They were the perfect couple, or at least, they appeared to be. David had always prided himself on his ability to control his environment. From his early days of building his company from scratch to his rise as a respected leader in the business world, he had mastered the art of managing both people and situations. He was feared by some, admired by others, and envied by many. His life was a well-curated performance, one in which every detail was accounted for, except for the growing distance between him and Sarah. In the beginning, their relationship had been like a dream. They were the kind of couple who seemed to belong together, their ambitions and aspirations aligning perfectly. Sarah had been his rock, his confidant, and his most trusted ally. She stood by him through the highs and the lows, helping him navigate the treacherous waters of success. Together, they were unstoppable. But over the years, something had shifted. It started slowly, imperceptibly at first. Sarah's once bright laughter had become rare, her smiles often feeling forced. She spent more time away from home, citing work obligations, last-minute meetings, and gatherings with friends he had never heard of before. David tried to ignore it, convincing himself that her busy schedule was simply a sign of her own professional growth. After all, they were both driven individuals, and it was natural for their lives to take them in different directions from time to time. Yet, as the months passed, David began to feel a creeping sense of unease. There were too many late nights, too many unanswered phone calls, and too many moments when Sarah seemed distant, even when she was right beside him. He told himself it was nothing, that he was being paranoid. After all, they had built this life together. They had survived worse. But the whispers had started. At first, they were soft, almost inaudible. A passing comment here, a hushed conversation there. In the office, where David was used to commanding respect, he noticed something had changed. His employees, once deferential, now exchanged knowing glances when he walked by. Laughter would abruptly stop when he entered a room, replaced by awkward silence and quick shifts in conversation. He could feel it. Something was wrong, and whatever it was, it had to do with Sarah. One evening, as Sarah hurriedly dressed for yet another last-minute meeting, David couldn't hold back any longer. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice careful but tinged with concern. Sarah glanced at him, her eyes cool and indifferent. "Of course," she replied, her tone dismissive. "It's just work. You know how it is." David wanted to press further, but the lifeless smile she gave him stopped him in his tracks. Before he could say more, she was out the door, leaving him alone in their large, empty house. Days turned into weeks, and David's suspicions grew. He had always been the man in control, the one who knew everything, who orchestrated his life and the lives of those around him with precision. But now, for the first time, he felt like he was on the outside looking in. His employees were talking behind his back, his wife was slipping away from him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The truth hit him like a freight train one afternoon as he worked late in his office. He had stayed behind to organize some documents when he overheard two of his employees talking in the hallway, unaware of his presence. "Did you hear? Sarah is with Carl now," one of them said, his voice low but clear. "Yeah, everyone knows." "Except David," the other replied, a hint of pity in his tone. David's heart stopped. Carl, his employee? His mind raced as he struggled to comprehend what he had just heard. Sarah, the woman he had given everything to, the woman who had been by his side through it all. was having an affair with Carl, a man who worked for him. Rage boiled up inside him, a burning fury that nearly blinded him. How could this be happening? How could they betray him like this? He was David, the man who controlled everything. He was the one in charge, the one who had built an empire from nothing. How could his own wife, his own employee, deceive him in such a way? That night, David sat in the dark, waiting for Sarah to return home. His mind was a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. When she finally walked through the door, he couldn't hold it in any longer. "Are you cheating on me with Carl?" he demanded, his voice shaking with the intensity of his emotions. Sarah froze, her hand still on the door handle. For a moment, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, surprise, perhaps, but it quickly faded, replaced by a cold, almost amused expression. She let out a short, bitter laugh, as if the situation were too absurd to even warrant a serious response. "Did you really think you had everything under control?" she asked, her voice dripping with disdain. "You always thought you could manipulate everyone, do whatever you wanted without consequences. Well, here's your consequence." David stared at her, unable to comprehend what he was hearing. This wasn't the Sarah he knew, the Sarah who had stood by him, who had loved him, who had been his partner in everything. But as she spoke, he realized that the woman he had known was gone, replaced by someone who had grown tired of being controlled, tired of being used. "I gave you everything," David said, his voice raw with desperation. "Why?" "You gave nothing," Sarah shot back. "You took, and I just played your game until I didn't need to anymore." Her words cut deeper than he had expected. He had thought he was in control, that he had everything, his business, his power, his marriage. But in that moment, he realized that it had all been an illusion. Sarah had been slipping away from him for a long time, and he had been too blind to see it. With a weary sigh, Sarah walked towards the door, her bag slung over her shoulder. She didn't look back as she spoke her final words to him. "Good luck with what's left of your life." And then she was gone. David stood in the middle of the room, alone with the deafening silence that now filled the space. He had lost everything, and for the first time in years, he didn't know how to fix it. The house felt colder, emptier, and as the night stretched on, David realized that he was no longer the man he once thought he was. He had been betrayed not only by Sarah, but by his own ambition, his own need for control. The life he had worked so hard to build was crumbling before his eyes, and he had no idea how to stop it. That night, David lay awake in the darkness, haunted by the realization that he was no longer in control of his own life. The depths of betrayal and a shattered identity. David woke the next morning feeling as though the world had shifted beneath him. The once familiar walls of his home now felt like a prison, their silence mocking him. He sat up in bed, staring at the empty side where Sarah used to sleep, the indentation of her body still faintly visible on the mattress. The sheets were cold, and the house was colder. He had no idea how long he had been lying there, but it felt like a lifetime had passed since Sarah had walked out of his life the night before. It wasn't just the affair with Carl that gnawed at him, though the betrayal burned deeply in his chest. What hurt more, what truly terrified him, was the realization that he had lost control, not just over Sarah, but over his entire life. The illusion of power that he had held onto for so long had been shattered, and he was left standing in the ruins of his carefully constructed world, unsure of who he was without it. For years, David had built his identity around success, around being the man who had everything under control, who could navigate any crisis, overcome any obstacle. But now, for the first time, he was facing a situation that he couldn't fix. There was no business strategy, no negotiation, no manipulation that could undo what had happened. Sarah was gone, and so was the life he had thought they shared. His mind wandered back to the early days of their relationship, the days when he and Sarah had been inseparable. They had been so young, so full of dreams and ambition. He remembered the late nights spent planning their future, the long conversations about what they wanted from life, and the certainty that together they could achieve anything. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. David had become consumed by his work, by the relentless pursuit of success, and Sarah had slipped through the cracks. He had always thought that Sarah understood, that she was with him in this journey, but now he realized that he had been wrong. He had taken her for granted, assuming that she would always be there, just as she had always been. But people don't stay when they feel invisible, and now, too late, David understood that Sarah had been drifting away from him for a long time. David sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cup of coffee he had made but couldn't bring himself to drink. His phone buzzed on the counter, the screen lighting up with messages from work. Urgent emails, missed calls, reminders of meetings that suddenly felt meaningless. He ignored them. For the first time in his life, David didn't care about work. He didn't care about the business or the deals he was supposed to close. All he could think about was Sarah, and how he had lost her. He glanced at the phone again, his thoughts turning to Carl. The rage that had simmered beneath the surface the night before began to bubble up again. Carl had been one of his employees, someone David had trusted, someone who owed his success to the company David had built. And now, Carl had taken the one thing that mattered most to him. Without thinking, David snatched the phone and dialed Carl's number. The phone rang once, twice, and then Carl's voice came through the line, calm and confident. "Hello. How could you?" David's voice shook with fury. "How could you do this to me? After everything I've done for you?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Carl spoke again, his tone measured. "David, I know this is hard for you to hear, but Sarah was never really happy with you. She told me everything. The way you treated her, the way you controlled her, this didn't just happen overnight." David felt his stomach drop. He had expected Carl to deny the affair, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness. But this calm, matter-of-fact response was something he hadn't anticipated. And worse, Carl was right. Deep down, David knew that he had pushed Sarah away long before Carl had ever come into the picture. "You're just a coward," David spat, trying to regain some sense of control. "You took advantage of her. You preyed on her when she was vulnerable." Carl sighed. "David, you're angry, and I get it. But this wasn't about me taking advantage of anyone. Sarah made her own choices. Maybe it's time you start looking at yourself instead of blaming everyone else." David slammed the phone down, his hands shaking with rage. How dare Carl talk to him like that? How dare he suggest that this was David's fault? But as the anger subsided, David was left with an uncomfortable truth. Carl was right. He had spent years building walls around himself, pushing Sarah away, and now he was paying the price. The rest of the day passed in a haze. David avoided his phone, ignoring the calls and messages from work. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Sarah, Carl, and the life that had slipped through his fingers. He wandered aimlessly through the house, each room a reminder of what he had lost. The kitchen, where he and Sarah used to cook together, now felt hollow. The living room, once filled with laughter and conversation, was now silent and still. As night fell, David found himself standing in front of the bedroom mirror, staring at his reflection. He barely recognized the man looking back at him. His eyes were bloodshot, his face drawn and haggard. He had always prided himself on being strong, composed, in control. But now he was falling apart. In a moment of desperation, David reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts. His thumb hovered over a familiar name. Helen. Helen had been a part of his life long before Sarah. They had met in college, back when David was still figuring out who he wanted to be. She had been his first real love, the person who had seen him for who he was, before the success and the ambition had taken over. But David had pushed her away too, trading their relationship for the pursuit of his career. He hadn't spoken to her in years, but her number was still there, as if he had always known he might need it one day. His pride told him not to call, not to show weakness. But pride had gotten him into this mess, and now he had nothing left to lose. With a deep breath, David pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, and then he heard her voice. A voice he hadn't heard in so long, but one that immediately brought back memories of a different time, a different life. "Hello." David hesitated, his throat tight. He hadn't planned what to say, hadn't even thought about why he was calling her, only that he needed to. "Helen, it's me," he finally managed to say, his voice trembling. "It's David." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and David could feel his heart pounding in his chest. When Helen finally spoke, her voice was calm, but there was a hint of surprise. "David," she said slowly, as if testing the name. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you. It's been a long time." David swallowed hard, unsure of how to continue. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. I didn't know who else to call." Another pause. "What's going on, David? Why are you calling me now, after all these years?" David closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his words before they even left his mouth. "I've lost everything," he whispered, the admission tasting bitter on his tongue. "Sarah, she's gone. She left me. I don't know what to do." He expected Helen to respond with anger, to tell him that he deserved it, that he had brought this on himself. But instead, she simply sighed, a sound that was neither surprised nor angry, but something else, something more resigned. "I'm sorry, David," she said softly, her voice carrying a sadness that mirrored his own. "But I don't know what you want from me." David swallowed hard. "I don't know either," he admitted. I just needed to talk to someone who might understand." Helen was silent for a long time, and David could hear the faint sounds of life in the background, the clinking of dishes, the soft hum of a television. It was a stark contrast to the deafening silence of his own home. "David," she finally said, her voice gentle but firm, "you made your choices. You chose your career, your ambition, over everything else. And now you're facing the consequences of those choices. I'm sorry you're going through this, but I can't fix it for you. No one can." David felt a lump rise in his throat. "I don't know how to fix it," he confessed, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to be anything without her." Helen sighed again, and for a moment, David thought she might hang up. But then she spoke, her words softer this time. "You'll figure it out, David, but not by looking back. Not by trying to hold on to something that's already gone." David sat in silence, her words sinking in. She was right, of course. He had spent so long trying to control everything, trying to bend the world to his will. But now he had no choice but to let go. "Thank you," he whispered, though the words felt inadequate, "for talking to me." "Take care of yourself, David," Helen said quietly. "I hope you find what you're looking for." And with that, she hung up, leaving David alone once again with the silence. But this time, it felt different. Less oppressive, more peaceful, in a way. As he put down the phone, David realized that for the first time in a long time, he had no idea what the future held. And maybe, just maybe, that was okay. The weight of consequence and the road to redemption. The days after Sarah's departure felt like a blur for David. Time moved differently, almost as if it had lost its rhythm, with each hour dragging endlessly and offering no respite from the suffocating thoughts that swirled in his mind. He had lost her. He had lost everything. The house, once a vibrant place of activity, now felt hollow. The walls echoed with the absence of Sarah's laughter, and every room reminded him of the life they had built together, the life he had single-handedly destroyed. The grandeur of the mansion, the finely curated decor, the neatly arranged spaces, they all felt like artifacts of a forgotten past, a museum of a life he no longer recognized. David spent most of his time sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the fireplace, his mind replaying scenes from his marriage. He thought about the day he and Sarah had first moved in, how they had laughed as they unpacked boxes, making plans for their future. He thought about the late nights when they had stayed up talking about their dreams, when they had believed that anything was possible as long as they were together. But as he sifted through these memories, David couldn't escape the darker ones, the arguments, the neglect, the way he had slowly pushed Sarah away without even realizing it. He had been so focused on his work, on his ambition, that he hadn't noticed her slipping further and further out of his grasp. He had taken her for granted, assuming that she would always be there, no matter how distant or cold he became. And now she was gone. His phone had rung several times over the past few days. Calls from his employees, from colleagues, even from a few friends who had heard rumors about what had happened. But David ignored them all. He wasn't ready to face the outside world, to confront the reality of his crumbling empire. Work had been his refuge for so long, but now, even that felt like a prison. The only call he had answered was Helen's, and though the conversation had been brief, it had left a lasting impact on him. Helen, the woman he had once loved deeply, had shown him more kindness than he deserved. She hadn't berated him, hadn't condemned him for his choices, but her words had cut deeper than any harsh critique could have. She had simply told him the truth he had been avoiding for so long. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with the consequences. David knew that he couldn't keep avoiding his life forever. Eventually, he would have to go back to the office, face his employees, and deal with the fallout from Sarah's affair with Carl. He would have to explain why his wife had left him, why the whispers in the hallways had been true. The thought of it made his stomach churn, but he knew it was inevitable. But before he could even think about work, there was something else he needed to do, something more important. David had spent his entire life chasing success, building his career and controlling every aspect of his world. But in the process, he had lost himself. He had become someone he barely recognized, someone cold, distant, and consumed by ambition. And now he needed to figure out who he was without all of that. He needed to rediscover the man he had once been, the man who had fallen in love with Sarah and dreamed of a life filled with love, not just power and success. One afternoon, after another sleepless night, David made a decision. He couldn't stay in this house any longer, surrounded by memories that only reminded him of his failures. He needed to get away, to clear his head, to find some clarity in the chaos that had consumed his life. He packed a small bag, grabbed his car keys, and drove out of the city without a destination in mind. He just needed to go, somewhere, anywhere that wasn't filled with reminders of his broken marriage. The farther he drove, the more the weight on his chest began to lift. The sprawling city skyline disappeared behind him, replaced by the rolling hills and open fields of the countryside. The air felt fresher out here, cleaner, as if he could finally breathe without the suffocating pressure of his old life pressing down on him. After hours of driving, David found himself in a small town nestled at the foot of a mountain range. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where the noise and chaos of the city felt a world away. There were no high-rise buildings, no traffic jams, just quaint little shops, cozy cafes, and locals who greeted each other with friendly waves. David parked his car in the town square and stepped out, feeling the cool breeze against his face. He hadn't been here before, but there was something comforting about the simplicity of it all. The town felt untouched by the frantic pace of modern life, as if it existed in a bubble of serenity that David desperately needed. He walked aimlessly through the streets, taking in the sights and sounds of the town. There was a small bookstore on the corner, its windows filled with old, well-worn books. Across the street, an elderly couple sat on a bench, feeding birds as they chatted quietly. And just down the road, a bakery's scent wafted through the air, reminding David that he hadn't eaten all day. He stepped into the bakery, the warmth of the oven enveloping him as the bell above the door jingled. The woman behind the counter greeted him with a smile, her apron dusted with flour. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice soft and welcoming. David glanced at the display case, filled with pastries, bread, and cakes, but his mind wasn't on food. He felt like a stranger here, out of place in a town that seemed so peaceful, so far removed from the turmoil of his life. "I'm not sure," he admitted, his voice hoarse from days of silence. "I just needed to get away." The woman studied him for a moment, her smile fading slightly as she seemed to understand. "Sometimes that's exactly what you need," she said, nodding. "To step away, take a breath, and figure things out." David nodded, grateful for her words even though she didn't know his story. He ordered a simple pastry and a cup of coffee, then found a seat by the window. As he ate in silence, he watched the people of the town go about their day. Mothers with strollers, teenagers on bikes, elderly couples walking hand in hand. It was a stark contrast to the life David had lived for so long, a life filled with meetings, deadlines, and the constant pressure to succeed. Here, in this quiet town, life seemed slower, more deliberate. People seemed to have time for each other, time for themselves. It was a life David hadn't known in years, and as he sat there, he began to wonder if he had been chasing the wrong things all along. For so long, he had defined himself by his success, by the size of his company, the scope of his influence. But what had that really gotten him? A failed marriage, a life of isolation, and a gnawing emptiness that no amount of power or wealth could fill. David finished his pastry and sat back, staring out the window at the mountains in the distance. He had come here to escape, but now he realized that he had come here to confront something far deeper. For years, he had been running from himself, from the mistakes he had made, from the truth he had refused to face. But now, sitting in this quiet little bakery, surrounded by the peaceful simplicity of this town, David felt something shift inside him. He couldn't go back to the life he had lived before. He couldn't go back to being the man who valued power and control above everything else. He couldn't rebuild his life on the same foundation that had led to his downfall. But he didn't know how to move forward, either. As the sun began to set over the mountains, casting a warm golden light over the town, David made a decision. He couldn't fix the past, but he could start over. He could begin the slow, painful process of rebuilding. Not his company, not his marriage, but himself. He didn't know what that journey would look like, or where it would lead him, but for the first time in a long time, David felt a glimmer of hope. He had spent years trying to control everything, trying to bend the world to his will. But now he realized that real power didn't come from control. It came from acceptance, from understanding that sometimes the only thing you can control is how you respond to the things that happen to you. David stood up, leaving a few bills on the table for his coffee and pastry. As he stepped outside, the cool evening air filled his lungs, and for the first time in days, he felt lighter. He wasn't healed, not by a long shot, but he was starting to see a path forward, a way to begin again. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready to face it, one step at a time, confronting the past, finding forgiveness. David awoke in the small hotel room he had rented on the edge of town, the morning light filtering through the thin curtains. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, his sleep had been peaceful. No dreams, no tossing and turning, just an empty stillness that, while unfamiliar, was a welcome reprieve from the relentless turmoil of his thoughts. The quiet of the room mirrored the quiet in his mind. In the solitude of this town, David felt far removed from the chaos he had left behind. The city, with all its noise, stress, and complications, felt like a distant memory. Here, in this unassuming town surrounded by mountains, the pace of life was slower, giving him the space he needed to think. But thinking was exactly what he had avoided for so long. He had left the city hoping to escape the consequences of his past, but deep down, David knew that no amount of distance would allow him to run from the truth. He had made choices that had hurt people, that had driven Sarah away, that had left him isolated and broken. And now, for the first time in years, he was being forced to face the reality of who he had become. After a simple breakfast in the hotel's small dining area, David wandered back through the town. The streets were already coming to life, the sounds of morning chatter and laughter filling the air as people greeted each other. The bakery from the day before caught his eye again, but today he passed it by, his mind pulling him toward something else. As David walked, his thoughts drifted back to Sarah, how much had changed between them, and how unaware he had been of the distance growing between them. He remembered how in the early years of their relationship they had been inseparable. They had shared everything, hopes, dreams, fears, and he had been proud to have her by his side. But over time, something had shifted. His ambition had become his obsession, and slowly, without even realizing it, he had pushed Sarah to the margins of his life. How had he not seen it? He stopped at a small park on the edge of town, where children played and families gathered under the shade of tall oak trees. He sat on a bench, watching the scene unfold, and wondered how many moments like this he had missed, moments of simplicity, of connection. He had been so consumed by the idea of building something bigger, something more, that he hadn't noticed the small, meaningful moments slipping through his fingers. David had always seen himself as the provider, the one who was responsible for creating a life of stability and success. But in his pursuit of that success, he had overlooked the emotional needs of the people who mattered most. He had taken for granted that Sarah would always be there, that their relationship could withstand the strain of his ambitions without effort or attention. But relationships didn't work that way. For too long, he had assumed that his role was to control, to lead, to dictate the terms of their life together. But control, he now realized, was the very thing that had driven Sarah away. In trying to maintain power over every aspect of his life, he had neglected the most important part, the human connections that made it all worthwhile. David had been so focused on building an empire that he had forgotten to build a life. The realization was painful, but it was a necessary first step. He couldn't change the past, but he could learn from it. He could begin to understand where he had gone wrong, not just in his relationship with Sarah, but in the way he had lived his entire life. As he sat there, a memory from years ago surfaced, something he had long buried in the back of his mind. It was a memory of Helen, back when they had been together in college, before his ambition had driven them apart. He remembered a conversation they had had one late night, sitting on the rooftop of their apartment, staring up at the stars. Helen had told him that she didn't care about the money or the success or the status. She had only cared about him, about who he was, not what he could achieve. At the time, David had dismissed her words as naive. He had thought that she didn't understand the world the way he did, that she didn't see the bigger picture. But now, sitting alone in this small park, watching families laugh and play, he realized that Helen had been right all along. She had seen something that David had been too blind to understand. She had valued the things that really mattered: love, connection, peace, and he had been too focused on chasing something else. And in doing so, he had lost not only Helen but himself. The memory brought a wave of sadness over him, but also a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in years, David wasn't thinking about his company, his reputation, or the empire he had built. He was thinking about the people he had hurt, the relationships he had damaged, and the man he had become. And that's when it hit him. He needed to make things right, or at least try. The thought of contacting Sarah again filled him with anxiety, but he knew it was inevitable. She had left him, and with good reason. But David wasn't seeking reconciliation. He was seeking closure for both of them. He needed to apologize, not to win her back, not to fix what was broken, but to take responsibility for his role in the unraveling of their relationship. But before he could face Sarah, there was someone else he needed to talk to: Helen. Their brief conversation had been a wake-up call for David, but it hadn't been enough. He needed to see her in person, to explain himself, to ask for her forgiveness, not just for leaving her all those years ago, but for how he had treated her, for the way he had pushed her aside in his relentless pursuit of success. It had been years since they had spoken, but David had a feeling that seeing Helen again would bring him the clarity he so desperately needed. She had always been the one who grounded him, the one who reminded him of what really mattered. And though he had let her go, he now realized that her influence on him had never truly left. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over her name. It felt strange, reaching out to someone he had once loved so deeply, but had lost in the process of becoming who he thought he wanted to be. But he knew it was something he had to do. With a deep breath, he pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before Helen picked up. Her voice was calm, just as it had been the last time they spoke, but there was a hint of curiosity in her tone. "David," she said, "I didn't expect to hear from you again so soon." "I know," David replied, his voice quieter than he had intended. "I'm sorry to call you out of the blue like this, but I need to see you. There's something I need to say in person." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, David wondered if she would refuse. He wouldn't blame her if she did. After all, he had left her behind years ago, and now here he was, asking for her time once more. But Helen was Helen, gracious, understanding, even after everything. "Okay," she finally said. "I'm in town. You can come by my place if you want." David let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thank you. I'll be there soon." He hung up the phone and sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts. This wasn't going to be easy. Facing Helen meant confronting the part of himself he had tried so hard to forget, the part of him that had once believed in love, in connection, in something deeper than success. But he knew he couldn't move forward until he faced it. With a sense of nervous anticipation, David made his way back to his car and drove to Helen's house. The town passed by in a blur, his mind focused entirely on what he was going to say, how he was going to explain himself. When he pulled up in front of her house, a small, modest home on the outskirts of town, he sat in the car for a moment, staring at the front door. His heart was racing, but he knew that this was a step he had to take. He got out of the car and walked up to the door, his hand trembling slightly as he raised it to knock. The door opened before he could. Helen stood there, her expression calm but curious, as if she had been expecting him. She looked different than he remembered, more peaceful, more settled in herself. There was a quiet strength about her, a sense of contentment that David found both comforting and intimidating. "David," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "Come in." He stepped inside, the familiarity of her home washing over him like a wave of nostalgia. It was simple, cozy, filled with books and personal touches that spoke of a life well lived. There were no signs of wealth or ambition here, just warmth and peace. They sat down in her living room, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. David took a deep breath, unsure of where to begin. But as he looked into Helen's eyes, he saw no judgment, no anger, just patience. "I don't even know where to start," David admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Helen smiled softly. "Then just start where you need to." David took another deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I've been thinking a lot about the past," he said slowly. "About the choices I made. About how I left you behind when I shouldn't have." Helen didn't interrupt. She just listened, her gaze steady, giving him the space he needed to speak. "I hurt you," David continued, his voice trembling. "I didn't realize it at the time, or maybe I did, but I didn't want to face it. I was so focused on building my career, on achieving success, that I lost sight of everything else. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I see that I was just running away." He paused, trying to find the right words. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for how I treated you, for how I left things between us. You deserve better than that." Helen was silent for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. Then she nodded, her eyes softening. "Thank you, David," she said quietly. "That means a lot to hear." David felt a weight lift off his chest, but there was still more he needed to say. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he added quickly. I know I can't undo the past, but I've been carrying this guilt with me for so long, and I needed to tell you." Helen's smile was gentle, filled with the same warmth he had always admired in her. "David," she said softly, "I forgave you a long time ago. I had to, for myself, not for you. Holding on to anger and resentment only keeps you trapped. I moved on with my life, and I'm at peace with what happened." Her words hit him like a wave of relief, but also a pang of regret. How had she found peace while he had been stuck in this cycle of ambition and control? "But forgiveness," she continued, her gaze steady, "doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean things go back to the way they were. It just means I've let go of the hurt. And I hope you can do the same for yourself." David nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. He hadn't expected this. Not her kindness, not her wisdom, not the depth of her understanding. In that moment, he realized that the closure he had been seeking wasn't about fixing things with Helen. It was about learning to forgive himself. They talked for a while longer, not about the past, but about life, about what had changed for both of them. Helen had built a life of peace, and David could see now that she had made the right choice when she let him go. She had found something he had spent his entire life chasing, but never grasping: contentment, happiness that wasn't tied to success or status. When it was time to leave, David stood at the door, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Thank you, Helen," he said softly, "for everything." She smiled, the same warm, gentle smile that had once made him fall in love with her. "Take care of yourself, David." As he walked away, David knew that he still had a long road ahead of him. But for the first time, he felt ready to walk it, without fear, without regret, and without the need for control. The fragile road to healing. David drove away from Helen's house, the weight of their conversation lingering in the air like a heavy mist. It was a strange feeling, being absolved of the guilt he had carried for so long, but it didn't bring the sense of finality he had imagined. Instead, it opened up new questions, new uncertainties. How do you begin again when you've spent so many years clinging to an identity that no longer serves you? How do you rebuild your life from the ground up when the foundation has already crumbled? The winding road through the countryside stretched out before him, lined with autumn trees shedding their leaves, their vibrant colors swirling in the wind. It felt symbolic, somehow, nature letting go, preparing for a season of renewal. He had been holding on for too long, clinging to the remnants of a life he no longer wanted. Now, like the trees shedding their leaves, it was time for him to let go. David drove aimlessly for hours, passing through small towns and open fields, the quiet landscape soothing in its simplicity. His mind wandered back to Sarah, to the life they had built, and the life that had fallen apart. The clarity he had gained with Helen still didn't extend to Sarah. There was too much pain there, too many wounds left unhealed. But David knew that if he was ever going to move forward, he needed to confront those wounds. He needed to talk to Sarah, to face the damage he had done to their marriage. But how could he? How could he ask for forgiveness from a woman he had betrayed, ignored, and taken for granted? The thought of calling her, of hearing her voice again, filled him with dread. What could he possibly say that would make a difference? What could he offer her now, after all this time? David pulled over at the edge of a small lake, the surface of the water reflecting the deep blue sky. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the shore, the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot breaking the otherwise perfect stillness. He sat down on a large rock by the water's edge, watching as the wind sent ripples across the surface, distorting the reflection of the sky. For the first time in days, he let his mind rest. He closed his eyes, listening to the soft sounds of nature around him. The gentle lapping of water against the shore, the rustling of leaves in the trees, the distant calls of birds flying overhead. It was peaceful here, away from the noise and the stress of the life he had known. And in that peace, David began to see the truth more clearly. He had been running from himself for years, running from the truth of who he had become, from the mistakes he had made, from the emptiness inside him that no amount of success could fill. And now, sitting by this quiet lake, he realized that the only way to stop running was to confront the pain head-on. The first step was Sarah. David knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew that he couldn't avoid it any longer. Sarah had left him because he had failed her, and if there was any hope of finding closure, any hope of healing, he needed to hear her side. He needed to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. With a deep breath, he pulled out his phone and stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over Sarah's number. It had been weeks since they had spoken, since that night when everything had fallen apart. He had been too ashamed, too lost in his own grief, to reach out. But now he knew it was time. He pressed the call button. The phone rang 3 times before Sarah answered, her voice cautious and distant. "David," she said, and just hearing her voice again sent a jolt of emotion through him. It was strange, familiar, yet so far away. "Sarah," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know where to start." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and David felt his heart pounding in his chest. He had imagined this conversation 1,000 times in his head, but now that it was happening, he didn't know what to say. "Why are you calling, David?" Sarah finally asked, her voice calm but guarded. "What do you want?" David closed his eyes, trying to steady himself. "I don't know," he admitted. I needed to talk to you, to apologize, to try to make sense of everything that happened." Another long silence. David could almost feel her weighing his words, deciding whether or not to let him in. "You hurt me," Sarah said quietly, her voice breaking the silence like a knife. "You hurt me more than you'll ever know." "I know," David whispered, his throat tightening with guilt. "I know I did. And I'm so sorry, Sarah. I never meant to." "Stop," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "I don't need to hear that you didn't mean to hurt me. You knew what you were doing. You chose your work over me. You chose control over love. You always had to be in charge, always had to have everything your way. And I couldn't live like that anymore." David felt a lump form in his throat. Her words were raw, and they cut deep, but they were the truth. He had spent so much time trying to control every aspect of his life, his business, his relationships, even Sarah, and in doing so, he had pushed her away, made her feel like she didn't matter. "I know," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. Truly. I was so focused on building something, on being successful, that I didn't see what I was losing in the process. I lost you, Sarah, and I lost myself." Sarah didn't respond right away, and David could hear the faint sound of her breathing on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, more vulnerable. "I waited for you, David," she said. "I waited for you to see me, to realize that I was right there beside you, wanting to be part of your life. But you never did. You were always too busy, too focused on everything else. I felt invisible." Her words struck him like a blow to the chest. Invisible. That's how he had made her feel. All those years, he had been so focused on his career, on his goals, that he hadn't noticed the person who mattered most slipping away. He had taken her for granted, assuming that she would always be there, no matter how little attention he gave her. "I'm sorry," David said again, his voice shaking. "I wish I could go back and change things, but I know I can't. I don't know how to make it right." There was another pause, and then Sarah sighed, a long, weary sound that carried the weight of everything they had been through. "I don't know if you can make it right," she said quietly. "Sometimes there's too much damage to fix." David felt his heart sink. He had known that this conversation wasn't going to lead to reconciliation, but hearing Sarah say those words still hurt. He had lost her, and there was no going back. But Sarah continued, her voice softening. "I think we both need closure. We've been holding on to this for too long. Maybe it's time to let go." David nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Maybe you're right. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them processing the enormity of what they had just said. For David, it felt like the end of something, an end he hadn't been ready to face, but one that was inevitable. He had lost Sarah long before she walked out the door, and now he was finally confronting that reality. "I hope you find what you're looking for, David," Sarah said softly, her voice tinged with a sadness that echoed his own. "I hope you figure out who you are, without all the noise." David swallowed hard, feeling the sting of her words. "I hope so, too." "Goodbye, David," she said, and before he could respond, the line went dead. David stared at the phone in his hand, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. The conversation had been painful, but it had also been necessary. For too long, he had been living in denial, refusing to face the truth of what had happened between them. But now there was no more denial, no more running. The marriage was over, and it was time to let go. But letting go wasn't the same as giving up. David knew that this wasn't just the end of his relationship with Sarah. It was the beginning of something new. It was the beginning of his journey toward healing, toward finding peace with himself and with the mistakes he had made. He stood up from the rock and walked back to his car, feeling a strange sense of lightness in his chest. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the lake and the trees. It was beautiful in a quiet, understated way, much like the life David was beginning to imagine for himself. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. Not with control, not with power, but with acceptance. He had lost much: his marriage, his sense of self, his illusions of control, but in the process, he had found something more valuable: the possibility of redemption. David started the car and drove back toward the town, the winding road stretching out before him like the path he was about to walk. It wouldn't be easy. Healing never was, but it was possible. And for now, that was enough. Rebuilding from the ruins. The days following David's final conversation with Sarah were a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. There was a certain peace in the knowledge that it was over, that the marriage that had once defined so much of his life had come to a definitive end. But peace didn't erase the deep sense of loss, nor did it alleviate the guilt that still clung to him like a shadow. He had driven back to the small town he had found solace in, not entirely sure what to do next. The open fields, the winding roads, and the quiet charm of the place felt like the perfect environment for reflection, and for the first time in years, David found himself without a clear plan. He had spent so much of his life meticulously plotting every step, every career move, every acquisition and deal, but now the path ahead was obscured by uncertainty. He wasn't the man he had been before, and he wasn't quite the man he wanted to become. He was in the in-between, a liminal space where old identities crumbled but new ones had not yet formed. And in this space, David knew that the only way forward was to rebuild. But this time, it wouldn't be the kind of rebuilding he had done before. There would be no empire to construct, no fortune to accumulate. This rebuilding would be quieter, slower, and much more personal. The first step, David realized, was learning to live without the constant need for control. His entire life had been dictated by his obsession with being in charge of his business, his relationships, his destiny. But now he had to learn to relinquish that need, to allow life to unfold without his relentless grip tightening around it. It wasn't easy. Every instinct he had screamed at him to take action, to start fixing, planning, doing. But he resisted. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to sit with the discomfort of uncertainty. He had rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, nestled between the hills and the forest, where he could find the solitude he craved. The cabin was simple, with just enough space for the essentials: a bed, a small kitchen, a fireplace, and a desk where he could sit and write. It was a far cry from the lavish penthouse he had once lived in with Sarah, but it felt more like home than any place had in years. Each morning, David would rise with the sun and go for long walks through the woods, letting the cool, crisp air fill his lungs and clear his mind. The silence of nature was a balm to his frayed nerves, and as the days passed, he began to notice the smallest details. The way the light filtered through the trees, the sound of leaves crunching beneath his feet, the distant call of birds high in the branches. It was as if the world was inviting him to slow down, to be present, to let go of the need to control everything. One afternoon, David decided to visit the small bookstore he had passed by on his first day in town. It was a quaint little shop, its windows filled with stacks of well-worn books, the kind of place where time seemed to stop. He had always been a voracious reader, but over the years, his reading had become limited to business books, self-improvement guides, and leadership manuals. He couldn't remember the last time he had picked up a book simply for the pleasure of reading. As he entered the store, the smell of old paper and leather-bound covers greeted him like an old friend. The woman behind the counter, an elderly lady with kind eyes, smiled at him as he wandered through the aisles, running his fingers over the spines of the books. There was something comforting about being surrounded by stories, by the collective wisdom and imagination of countless authors. David picked up a novel he had heard of but never read. A classic, one that had been recommended to him many times over the years, but that he had never found the time for. He paid for the book and left the store, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. It was a small step, but it felt significant. For the first time in a long time, he was allowing himself to slow down, to enjoy the simple pleasures of life. Back at the cabin, David spent the evening curled up by the fireplace, reading. The story pulled him in, transporting him to another world. And for a few hours, he forgot about his own life, his own struggles. It was a welcome escape, but it also reminded him of something he had lost along the way. His sense of curiosity, of wonder. He had been so focused on achieving, on becoming someone, that he had forgotten how to simply be. As the fire crackled and the words on the page blurred in the fading light, David closed the book and stared into the flames. He thought about Sarah, about Helen, about the people he had hurt in his pursuit of success, and he thought about the person he had been. The man who had once believed that success was the only thing that mattered, that power and control were the ultimate goals in life. But now, in the quiet of the cabin, surrounded by nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees and the crackling of the fire, David realized that he no longer wanted to be that man. Success, as he had once defined it, no longer appealed to him. He didn't want to spend his life chasing goals that left him feeling empty. He wanted something more, something deeper, something that couldn't be measured by wealth or power. The next morning, David woke with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't the kind of purpose that came from ambition or drive, but rather a quiet determination to rebuild his life in a way that felt authentic, meaningful. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that the first step was to reconnect with the parts of himself that he had lost along the way. He started by reaching out to old friends, people he had drifted away from over the years. Some were surprised to hear from him. Others were hesitant, unsure of what had prompted the sudden change in him. But David didn't let that stop him. He was honest with them about his mistakes, about the way he had let his career consume him. And slowly, some of those old friendships began to rekindle. It wasn't easy. Many of the relationships had been damaged beyond repair, but those that remained became a source of comfort, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this journey. One of the most difficult relationships to rebuild was with his younger sister, Emily. They had always been close growing up, but as David's career took off, he had drifted away from his family. Emily had tried to reach out to him over the years, but David had always been too busy, too focused on his work, to make time for her. When their father had passed away, David had been absent, dealing with a business crisis on the other side of the country. Emily had never forgiven him for that. It took weeks of phone calls, apologies, and difficult conversations before Emily finally agreed to meet him for lunch in a nearby town. When they sat down together, there was an awkwardness between them that hadn't been there before, but there was also a sense of possibility. a chance to rebuild the bond they had once shared. "I've missed you," David said quietly, stirring his coffee as he looked across the table at his sister. "I know I haven't been there for you the way I should have. I'm sorry." Emily studied him for a moment, her expression guarded. "You hurt me, David," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "You weren't there when I needed you most. And it wasn't just about Dad. It was everything. You disappeared from my life, and I didn't know how to reach you." "I know," David said, his throat tightening. "I was so caught up in my own world, in my own need for control, that I didn't see how much I was losing. But I'm trying to change. I'm trying to be better." Emily nodded slowly, her gaze softening. "I hope you can, David. But it's going to take time. You can't just undo the past with an apology." "I know," he said. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I just want to try." Their conversation that day wasn't a miracle fix, but it was a beginning. Over the following months, David and Emily spoke more often, and slowly the distance between them began to close. They weren't the same people they had been before, but they were learning to rebuild their relationship in a new way, one based on honesty, vulnerability, and mutual respect. As the months passed, David continued to rebuild his life, piece by piece. He began to volunteer at the local community center, helping to mentor young entrepreneurs who were just starting out in their careers. It was a way for him to give back, to share his knowledge and experience without the pressure of building another empire. He found that he enjoyed helping others succeed, not because it brought him recognition, but because it brought him a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. He also began to explore his own creative side, something he had neglected for far too long. He started painting, not with any particular goal in mind, but simply because it allowed him to express himself in a way that didn't involve words or numbers. The act of creating something with his hands, of letting go of the need for perfection, was liberating. It became a form of meditation for him, a way to quiet his mind and focus on the present moment. David knew that he would never be the man he had once been, and he was grateful for that. The person he was becoming, slowly, painstakingly, was someone who valued connection over control, meaning over ambition, and love over power. And as he stood on the porch of his cabin one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: contentment. It wasn't the kind of fleeting happiness that came from achieving a goal or closing a deal. It was a deep, quiet sense of peace, the kind that came from knowing that he was finally living a life that was true to himself. He still had a long way to go. There were wounds that hadn't fully healed, relationships that needed more time, and parts of himself that he was still discovering. But for the first time in years, David wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't trying to control the outcome or force things to happen. He was simply allowing life to unfold, trusting that each step he took was leading him toward something better. He had lost much, but in the process, he had found something far more valuable: the strength to rebuild, the courage to face his past, and the wisdom to live a life defined not by success, but by meaning. And for now, that was more than enough.